Hey there, sleepy soul. Welcome to Sleepy Love Notes, the perfect place to wind down, relax, and let your dreams take flight. I'm so glad you're here. Before we begin this cozy little journey, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us keep the sleepy stories coming. Also, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Alright, now let's get you nice and cozy. Take a deep, calming breath in and slowly let it out. Let the world fade away as your mind gently drifts into this story. You're safe here, you're loved, and your dreams are waiting for you. Let's begin. Tonight, we're entering the quiet, haunted world of 1922, a novella by Stephen King. It's a story not of loud frights or crashing monsters, but of slow unravelings, of guilt that grows like ivy on the walls of the mind, and of the kind of haunting that doesn't come from ghosts alone, but from the choices we make and how they stay with us, in the creak of floorboards, in the corners of rooms, and in the spaces between dreams and waking. 22 is set in the open farmland of Nebraska, in a time when the sky stretched wide and blue during the day and turned to black velvet studded with stars at night. It was a time of silence, of long, hot summers and fields of corn rustling in the wind, where the nearest neighbour might be a mile down the road. And the land wasn't just where you lived, it was who you were. This is where we find our narrator, a farmer named Wilfred James, who loves his land more than anything in the world. He tells us his story as a kind of confession, written down, quietly, after the years have passed, as though finally whispering the truth out into the dark, hoping the telling of it might finally let him sleep. The story begins in Hemingford Home, Nebraska, a place as humble and peaceful as its name suggests. But beneath that quiet charm, something darker stirs. It begins with a simple conflict. A husband and a wife who disagree on what their future should look like. But as the days pass, a stubbornness turns to resentment, and resentment turns to fear. What unfolds is a slow, eerie descent into consequences that ripple across time. Stephen King wrote this tale as part of Full Dark, No Stars, a collection of stories that ask what happens when ordinary people take one wrong step into the shadows and then find they can't find their way back. But don't worry, dear listener. We're going to take our time. No rush, no sharp turns. Just a gentle walk along the dusty roads and through the creaking hallways of this tale. You'll hear the wind rustling in the cornfields, feel the fading sun on your skin, and smell the dry earth after a summer storm. You'll meet Wilf and his wife Arlette, and their teenage son, Henry, and you'll watch their story unfold like a letter written slowly by candlelight, with heavy hands and a heavier heart. We'll stay close to the characters. We'll follow the story with softness, with compassion, and with care. There will be shadows, yes, but they'll pass over us like clouds at dusk, never frightening, only thoughtful and quiet and true. So for now, let yourself melt into the hush of an old farmhouse, the scent of old wood, of linen sheets, of tobacco and soil. Let the world outside your room fall away, and step with me into 1922, where every creak of a floorboard holds a memory, and every breeze through the corn whispers the past. Shall we begin, sleepy soul? Chapter 1. The Conflict in Hemingford Home. Story begins not with a bang, nor with a scream, but with the scratch of pen on paper, the hushed sound of confession taking shape beneath a dim hotel room light. Wilfred James, a man of the soil, sits alone as the past seeps out of him. Not quickly, not easily, but like thick sap from a wounded tree. He tells us, right from the start, that what we're about to read is a confession, not of a single moment of weakness, but of a long, slow fall, of a life cracked down the middle by one terrible decision, and everything that grew in its shadow. His handwriting is neat but tired. His words are plain, drawn from the earth like the corn he once planted. He's not a poet. He's not dramatic. He is simply haunted by what happened in 1922. Back then, Wilfred lived on a modest farm in Hemingford Home, Nebraska, a small town with wide fields, silent roads, and neighbors who nodded from a distance. He worked the land with quiet pride. The plow in his hands felt like an extension of himself. He could read the soil the way others read newspapers, the way it cracked beneath the sun, the scent of coming rain, the feel of a healthy crop beneath his boots. But his wife, Arlette, saw something very different. To Arlette, the farm was a prison of dust and drudgery. She'd been born in town, raised on noise and activity, on sidewalks and shop windows, on music drifting from open windows and the bright promise of elsewhere. She was sharp-tongued, strong-willed, and growing restless. In the spring of 1922, she made her intention clear. She wanted to sell her portion of the land left to her by her father, and move to the city. Omaha, she said, a place with people and lights and things to do. Wilfred, however, was rooted. The thought of losing even a piece of his land was like losing part of himself. And worse still, Arlette's plan would split the farm in half, cut it down the middle like a wound. They argued quietly at first, sharp whispers over dinner, long silences after chores. Then the words grew louder, more frequent, until the very walls of the farmhouse seemed to hum with bitterness. Their son, Henry, just 14, was caught in the middle. Arlette said he could attend school in the city, get a real education, make something of himself. Wilfred said the boy belonged to the land, same as he had, same as his father before him. He spoke to Henry in the fields, between rows of cornstalks, in the quiet intimacy of father and son. And slowly, subtly, he began to turn the boy's heart away from his mother. Not through cruelty, not with lies, but with soft-spoken stories about tradition and strength and staying true to one's roots, with looks that said we're in this together, with sighs that seemed heavier when Arlette was near, with silent nods that suggested she just doesn't understand us. Henry began to withdraw from his mother, his eyes colder, his tone sharper. He took up more chores, stood beside his father longer. Arlette noticed, of course, but Wilfred only shrugged, said the boy was growing up, finding his own way. Still, the house felt colder. The air grew thick, not with summer heat, but with tension that clung to every surface. Arlette drank more wine in the evenings. She stared out the window for hours. Sometimes she would hum under her breath, tuneless, joyless. A sound like something unraveling. The world outside rolled on. Cicadas hummed their slow lullaby. The fields rippled gold in the breeze, and neighbors nodded politely when passing by. No one knew. No one saw. Inside that farmhouse, something was beginning to rot, not in the walls, but between the people who shared them. Wilfred watched it happen, calm on the surface, but deep inside, a plan was beginning to take shape. A dark, quiet thought, like a seed pressed deep into the earth. not yet sprouted, but waiting. And so, the conflict in Hemmingford home took root. A simple disagreement between husband and wife that began to stretch and twist, to burrow into their lives like roots cracking stone. Outside, the cicadas sang. Inside, footsteps fell soft and slow across the wooden floor. And somewhere in the quiet, the future shifted ever so slightly off course. Chapter 2. The Terrible Decision. Sometimes, the deepest shadows don't fall all at once. They slide in slowly, like dusk bleeding into evening, until the light is gone and you can't quite say when it left. That's how it was in the farmhouse, in Hemmingford home. After Arlette announced her intention to sell the land and leave, something inside Wilfred began to quietly wither. He didn't scream. He didn't rage. He simply hardened. Every day, he woke early, watched the corn shimmer in the morning breeze, and listened for signs that things might turn back around. But they didn't. Arlette became sharper. The arguments grew crueler. She spoke of lawyers now, of deeds and signatures, of rights and claims, and how much her half of the land was worth. Her voice, once spirited, now had an edge like glass, and behind her words was something even colder. Finality. She was leaving, and she was taking their son if she could. Wilf felt it like a slow knife. He'd built his life in that soil. Every furrow, every fence post, every weary footstep in the field, it all meant something to him. He was not just losing land, he was losing belonging. He began spending longer hours outside, working without purpose, just to feel the rhythm of the land beneath his boots. But in the evenings, he watched Henry. The boy had always been quiet, but now there was a tension in him. A young heart pulled in two directions. He still did his chores, still followed his father's voice, but there was worry in his eyes, especially when Arlette raised her voice, especially when she called him Hank with that impatient snap. And Wilfred, slow and careful as a spider weaving silk, began to draw the boy in. He didn't say she deserves it. He didn't say we have to stop her. No, Wilf whispered other things. That life isn't fair. That people sometimes ruin what they don't understand. That the land was meant to be passed from father to son, not sold off like bolts of cloth. Henry listened. He didn't answer much, but the space between him and his mother grew colder, and Wilfred could see it. The shift, the alignment. And then, one night, under a pale and watchful moon, Wilf made a decision so quiet, so terrible, that even the walls seemed to hold their breath. He approached Henry not with anger, but with grief. He laid it out not as a scheme, but as a sorrow. He said it gently, as if asking the boy to help bury a wounded animal, not to harm, but to end something that was already broken. Henry didn't answer right away. He just sat there, his hands in his lap, eyes fixed on a knot in the floorboards. And then he nodded. The day was chosen, the plan was made, and all of it felt unreal, like a dream from which no one woke. The act itself happened on a night thick with cicadas. The fields whispered softly in the dark. The air was warm, but not kind. Arlette had been drinking, as she did most nights by then. Her tongue was sharp. She taunted Wilf, mocked the farm, spoke of cities and life without them. And then, in the kitchen, as the oil lamp flickered and shadows curled along the walls, Wilfred and Henry stepped forward. The moment came slowly. It wasn't sudden. It rose like a tide. There was shouting, brief and brittle, a crash, A gasp, a silence, and then stillness. Just stillness. Arlette James lay crumpled in the kitchen, her breath stilled, her voice gone. The moonlight spilled in through the windows, casting her in silver. Outside, the cicadas sang on, indifferent. Wilfred knelt beside her, not in panic, but in a heavy, shuddering calm. The silence in the house was complete. Together, father and son carried her body to the edge of the property, to the old, dry well that hadn't been used in years. The grass rustled against their boots. The wooden boards creaked under their weight. The ropes groaned. And then she was gone, lowered into that quiet black throat of earth like a secret buried in the dark. Wilfred paused before replacing the boards. For just a moment, he looked up. The stars above were cold and still. No judgment, no forgiveness, just the hush of the world, watching. Back in the house, Henry didn't speak. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands resting on his knees, his face pale in the lamplight. Wilfred touched his shoulder, but the boy flinched. It had been done. The choice made. But in the silence that followed, something unseen stirred in the corners of the room. Not a sound, not a shadow, but a feeling, a sense that something had been broken that could never be put right again. Something old, something deep, something that had always been watching from the edge of the fields, and now it was moving. Chapter 3. Covering the Crime. Morning came, as it always does, soft and golden, bathing the fields in warm, sleepy light, casting long shadows over the earth. And over the house that stood at the edge of it all, quiet now, in a way that no morning should ever be. Wilfred rose with the sun. He moved carefully, as if the floorboards might splinter beneath his feet. The kitchen still smelled faintly of spilled wine. There were smudges on the floor, things that needed cleaning, traces of the night before. Arlette was gone, but her presence lingered. He set about his task with methodical silence, like a man repairing a broken fence or mending a tool. Together, Wilfred and Henry returned to the well. They brought lime, a sheet and boards to seal it better than before. There was no speaking between them, only the wind rustling the corn and the dull echo of hammer on nail as the old boards went back into place. Newer, stronger, and laid with care. They had buried her body, but not the truth. The truth had taken root, deep down in the soil and in their hearts. Wilfred began to shape a story, one of abandonment, not death. He told the neighbours Arlette had packed up and left, tired of the farm, eager for the city. "She's gone to Omaha," he said, his voice flat and practiced. She was never meant for this life, and some believed it. Or at least they didn't question it too closely. A few raised eyebrows. Mrs. Robertson from down the road came by with suspicion behind her pie. She asked about Arlette's things, why she left without her sewing kit, without saying goodbye to Henry. Wilfred shrugged. Some people, he said, just snap. He played the grieving husband, the confused father. He stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, his eyes lowered just enough to look sorrowful, but not too sorrowful. But behind the calm mask, his thoughts were growing strange. He spoke to himself when no one was around. He repeated small things over and over. It's done now. It had to be done. He would hear footsteps at night, only to find empty rooms. The rocking chair would creak softly in the parlour. The cellar door would be slightly ajar. He began to check the well at dawn and again at dusk, though he never said why. And then the rats came. At first it was only one. He saw it in the barn, a long dark shape moving in the hay, its eyes glinting. He killed it with a shovel, but then another came, and another, and soon they were everywhere. Small, silent, persistent. In the cellar, in the walls, scurrying behind the grain sacks, gnawing at the edges of sleep. They were not bold. They did not attack. They simply appeared, as if drawn to something, as if summoned. Wilfred never spoke of them to Henry. The boy had grown pale, gaunt. He no longer sat by the fire, no longer asked questions, no longer smiled. He worked the fields with his father by day, and by night he stared out the window, as if watching for someone to return. Sometimes Wilfred thought he heard whispering, not voices, not quite, but something softer than speech. A rustle just behind the ears, a sensation like cold breath on the back of the neck. The farmhouse had become a kind of tomb, not filled with sorrow, but with silence, a heavy, stretched silence that seemed to press in on all sides. Wilfred tried to maintain routine. He sharpened tools. He painted the porch railing. He wrote in his ledger, but his thoughts were fragmented now. Sentences that looped, logic that wandered. She wanted to leave. I didn't force her to want that. It was best for Henry. The land belongs to us. It always has. But even in these justifications, there were cracks. He could feel them in his sleep, in the way his dreams twisted, in the way the rats moved closer, to the center of the house, as if circling something. The corn grew high and green that summer. The sun was generous. The storms were mild, and yet the air around the farm remained wrong. The neighbors came less often. Even the mailman seemed to linger at the gate instead of coming up to the porch. Something had shifted, not in the land, but in the soul of it. In the place where families grow, where life rises from the dirt, where laughter echoes on summer nights. There was now only silence. A silence filled with tiny feet in the walls, with a rocking chair that swayed without touch, with a well that no longer held water, and with a man who had crossed a line he could not uncross. Chapter 4. The rot sets in. There comes a time after a great wrong when the world around you doesn't shout or strike back, but simply sinks into stillness, into silence, into a kind of decay that feels like waiting. And that was what the farm became. Not a house, not a home, but a waiting place. It began with the dreams. Wilf would fall asleep to the hum of cicadas and the crackle of dry grass, but in the dark places of his mind, Arlette would return, not angry, not screaming, just there, watching, standing in the kitchen with her wine glass, or at the foot of the bed with her hair damp and tangled. Sometimes she whispered. Sometimes she only looked. And in those dreams, he couldn't speak, couldn't move, could only listen to the sound of rats in the walls, skittering and scratching. Every morning, he woke soaked in sweat, his mouth dry, his hands trembling just enough that he had to sit for a moment before standing. The rats grew bolder. They no longer waited for nightfall. Wilf saw them in the pantry, on the stairs, their eyes glassy, their bodies thin. They chewed through sacks of grain. They left droppings in the flour bin. He set traps. He laid poison. But they always came back. And Henry was slipping away. The boy barely spoke now. His gaze had turned inward, like someone walking through a fog that only he could see. He stopped meeting Wilf's eyes. His footsteps were slow, like he was carrying something too heavy to set down. Then came the girl, Shannon Cottery. She was soft-spoken and wide-eyed, with freckles like stars across her nose. Wilf remembered her from church before they'd stopped going. Now, she came to the edge of the property, waiting at the fence line with her bicycle, calling to Henry in the evenings. Wilf watched from the window, his mouth tight. He didn't like it, not because Shannon was unkind, but because she was a way out, a door. Henry would ride off with her on weekends, disappearing for hours. He began to speak again, but not to Wilf. The boy's hands were always in his pockets now, shoulders slouched, voice distant. Wilf knew what was happening. Henry was planning to leave. He'd seen the signs, the tucked away money, the half-packed satchel under the bed, and though he tried to talk to him, tried to explain once more why they'd done what they'd done, Henry would only shake his head, like a man listening to wind, not words. "You said it was for us," Henry murmured once, not looking at him. "But it was really for you, wasn't it?" Wilf didn't answer. Couldn't, because maybe it was. And outside the farm began to mirror the rot within. The corn wilted before its time. The hogs grew sickly, restless. One was found dead near the fence, its throat bitten, though no predator tracks were found. The chickens stopped laying. The barn smelled wrong, like damp wood and mildew and something deeper, something sour. Neighbors noticed. A few came by, offering help, or advice, or scripture. Wilf nodded, said he was just tired, said the weather had turned strange. But they didn't stay long. No one stayed long anymore. At night, the wind whispered through the fields, and in the attic, the floor creaked under unseen weight. He began to hear her voice, not in dreams now, but in waking moments. Low, crooning. "Wilf," she would say, soft and sing-song, like she was standing just behind the door. Sometimes he opened it. No one there. Sometimes he didn't. The rocking chair in the parlor moved on its own. Once, he found muddy footprints by the well. Bare, narrow, small, and the rats. Oh, the rats were never far. He saw them watching from the rafters. They no longer fled at the sound of boots. They only blinked, as if to say, "We're still here." The weight of the crime no longer hid in the shadows. It had begun to take shape, not as a scream, not as a ghost, but as decay, as loss, as the slow collapse of everything Wilfred had once clung to. And so he held tighter, to the farm, to the routines, to the belief that he could still own this story. But the land no longer listened. The house no longer obeyed. The boy he'd twisted into silence was twisting away from him. And the truth had started to rise. Not as a confession, not yet, but as a kind of sickness, a shadow that bloomed behind his eyes. And somewhere, in the deep places beneath the house, beneath the fields and fences and lies, something was watching, something that remembered. Chapter 5. The Young Lovers Flee. It began with a note, folded, creased and tucked beneath Wilf's empty coffee cup. The ink was hurried, the words were few, and the silence between them, cavernous. "Don't come after us. We're gone. I'm sorry, Dad. I tried to stay. No goodbye, no hug." Just that trembled scrap of Henry's hand. They'd fled in the night. Henry and Shannon. Two young hearts beating too fast. Two souls crushed under the weight of a secret too dark to carry. Omaha was where they headed. The big city. A place of lights and alleys, of trains and motels, and streets that swallowed up country boys like Henry whole. For days, Wilf stood at the front gate, hat in hand, staring down the empty road. Every shadow became his son's silhouette. Every breeze carried the ghost of a goodbye he never got. He'd hoped foolishly that Henry might stay, that the farm, this patch of soil stained with sweat and blood, might still bind him. But guilt is a stronger tether than land, and Henry had already begun to fray. Wilf read the first letter by candlelight. It came folded in an envelope, marked from a church shelter in Omaha. The writing was rough, words pressed hard into the paper, like, Henry had clenched the pencil too tightly. We're okay. We've got jobs, small ones. Shannon's working at a diner. I sweep floors. It's not much, but we're together. I think about Mom sometimes, about what we did. I don't sleep well. Wilf read it 3 times, his fingers trembling at the edges. He didn't cry. Not then. More letters came, sporadic and uncertain, each one thinner in tone, like Henry was fading between the lines. One said Shannon was sick, another said money was running out. The last one, it never arrived. Instead, it came in the voice of a sheriff, stern and quiet, who showed up at the farm gate one afternoon with his hat in his hand. There's been a situation, he said gently. 2 young folks. A robbery gone wrong. Guns. Blood. Both dead before the ambulance came. The world did not explode. It simply stopped. Wilf sat down on the porch steps, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He looked past the sheriff, past the trees, the fields, the sagging barn, and into something far beyond. They were buried side by side, Shannon Cottery and Henry James, star-crossed not by fate, but by a wound that had never healed. One he'd given them. Romeo and Juliet, some might say. But there were no balconies, no poison vials, no tearful monologues. Only a grim grey motel room, a bag of stolen bills, and the echoes of a single gunshot. Then another. Wilf stood at the edge of their grave and said nothing, because what could he say? What words could reach the dead when they had fled this world to escape the weight of his sins? Back on the farm, the wind howled louder. The doors groaned in protest. Floorboards shifted under invisible weight. The rats were no longer hidden. They scurried boldly across the floor, watched him from atop shelves, nested in walls. Their eyes glittered like shards of coal, always watching, never blinking. The house had become a body, breathing with sorrow. Every window was a weeping eye, every stair a sigh, every night a chorus of creaks and whispers, and still, Wilf stayed. Because where else could he go? This was his kingdom, his confession, his prison. He spoke aloud sometimes, to no one in particular, to Henry, to Arlette, to the emptiness. I didn't mean for this, he whispered once into the kitchen air. I thought we could have a life. But the silence gave no comfort, only memory, only the echo of boots on hardwood, of a boy's laughter that no longer rang through the halls. He sat most nights in the parlour, lamp flickering beside him, rats gnawing somewhere nearby. The fire burned low, but never out. He couldn't leave, wouldn't, because if he did, who would bear witness to what had happened here? The farm had become a story, A slow, unraveling tale of love turned to rot, of blood buried and bones forgotten. And Wilf, he was its final reader, its only mourner, its last lonely page. Chapter 6. The Collapse. The days passed without names. The nights stretched longer than seemed possible, like someone had unstitched time, let it unravel thread by thread. Wilfred James, once a farmer with strong hands and soil under his nails, was now something else entirely. Not quite man, not yet ghost, caught in a space between silence and reckoning. The barn was the first to fall. A storm rolled in one dusky evening, slow and grey, like a sigh. The wind whistled like a voice through hollow wood. The rain began to fall in soft, relentless needles. And then, with a crack not unlike a bone breaking, the old barn, where Henry once helped stack hay, where the cows lowed at twilight, collapsed inward. A groan, a moan, and then dust. Wilf stood in the doorway of the farmhouse, a lantern in his hand, and watched it fall. He did not shout. He did not run. He simply watched. Inside the house, the decay mirrored the land. The walls flaked like dried petals. Floorboards bowed beneath him. The wallpaper curled and wept at the edges. The rats were no longer shy. By daylight, they scuttled across the table. One perched on the mantel, unmoving, as if it were a clock marking some strange hour of doom. Others gathered near the hearth, watching him as he shuffled through rooms he no longer recognized. Sometimes he swore they whispered. Tiny voices, dry as wind through cornstalks. You know what you did. He followed you into the dark. She's waiting at the bottom. He tried to answer once, spoke aloud to the silence, but his voice cracked like frost-split wood. No one answered. His teeth began to rot. One fell loose in the night, cradled on his pillow like a tiny ivory seed. His gums bled when he chewed. He stopped chewing. He stopped eating much at all. The skin sagged on his bones. His clothes hung like they'd been made for someone else. He coughed through the mornings, and his breath smelled of dust and old regret. His eyes sank into his skull, not just from hunger or time, but from the weight of memory. When he looked in the mirror, he didn't see Wilfred James anymore. He saw something gaunt and paper-thin, a husk, a man-shaped echo. Neighbours stopped coming. The mail stopped arriving. Once, Mrs. Harlan from the Cottery place drove past, slowed her truck, then pressed the gas again without waving. The town whispered. They said the James boy ran off and died, that Arlette abandoned them both, that Wilf was cursed, or mad, or worse. Some claimed they saw him talking to himself in the fields. Others said they heard scratching from inside the walls when they passed the house. No one came close enough to find out. He was a ghost among the living, moving slow and silent through the market, when he went at all. Eyes averted, lips never parting. No one asked him questions, because everyone already knew the answers. And then, when the weight of silence grew too thick, when even the rats seemed tired of speaking to him, he picked up a pen, not to write a letter, not to send out a cry for help, but to tell his story, to pour it out onto yellowed pages in that low, rattling voice of guilt that had never left him. It began simply, like a man clearing his throat in a cathedral. In 1922, I murdered my wife, Arlette, a confession. Not to be heard, not to be judged, only to be spoken. as if telling the story might lay the ghosts to rest, as if words, fragile and fleeting as they are, might offer some kind of peace. He wrote in the parlour, by the flickering light of a single candle. The rats watched, the wind whispered, and Wilf, brittle, bent, and utterly alone, kept writing as if the act itself was the only thing holding the house together. Chapter 7. The Final Pages. The hotel was small, a narrow building tucked between boarded-up shops on the edge of Omaha, with buzzing neon in the window and wallpaper that peeled like old skin. Wilf paid in cash. The clerk didn't ask for a name, didn't make small talk, just handed him a key and turned back to his radio. Room 6 was upstairs at the end of the hall. The carpet was worn thin, the ceiling cracked and water-stained. The bed creaked when he sat down, and the single lamp beside it cast long, quivering shadows across the walls. He had brought little with him, just a satchel, a single shirt, and a bundle of handwritten pages folded carefully within a tobacco tin. The letter, the full truth, or at least all of it he could bear to speak aloud. He wasn't sure what had brought him here, so far from the farm, so close to the city where his son had died. Maybe it was guilt, circling back. Maybe it was some slow instinct to find the place where the story needed to end. Or maybe he simply couldn't stay there anymore. The house had stopped sleeping. The whispers came even in the day. Shadows moved without light. The rats, those small watching things, had grown bold. They filled the corners of his vision. They danced just beyond the mirror's edge. So he came here, to a place where no one knew him, where death might be quieter. He lay back on the hotel bed, hands folded across his chest, the letter resting beside him like a child curled close. And he wrote the final lines, with slow shaking fingers, each sentence carved like gravestones in ink. This is what I have done. This is who I am. And if there is a reckoning waiting, may it find me gently. He didn't sign his name. He didn't need to. There was no one left to recognize it. The air in the room was still, but it was a listening kind of stillness, as if the walls were holding their breath. He closed his eyes for a time, not to sleep exactly, just to drift. Outside, the city murmured. Cars passed, sirens howled distantly. Life continued. But inside room 6, time had slowed to a hush. Somewhere near midnight, he heard the scratching. Soft, persistent, deliberate. At first, he thought it might be the building settling, the groan of pipes or wood. But then it came again, closer, a scuffle beneath the bed, a tiny clawed footfall on the windowsill, the flick of a tail just beyond the shadow of the lamp. He sat up slowly. And there, in the corner of the room, they gathered. Rats, small and grey, dozens of them, more than he'd ever seen, not scurrying, not afraid, just watching. One crept up the bedpost, paused at the edge of the blanket, and met his eyes. It was not hate he saw, nor anger, not even hunger, just truth. That cold, ancient truth that lives in soil and bone, in deeds done in silence, in the weight a man carries long after the world has turned its back on him. The rats had always known. From the well to the field, from the house to this final room, they had followed, not to torment, but to bear witness. He did not cry out. He did not run. He simply turned his head, laid it gently against the pillow, and breathed, once, then again, and then no more. When the hotel, Clerk came the next day. Drawn by the unpaid bill and the stillness that seemed too heavy, he found Wilf lying just so, peaceful even. Beside him, the tin box, and inside it, page after page of neat, slanted handwriting. The story of a man, a wife, a son, a farm, and a silence that grew louder with every year. The clerk read only the first line. In 1922, I murdered my wife, Arlette. He paused, then folded the letter closed, set it gently on the nightstand, and walked back down the stairs. He didn't take it, didn't throw it away, just left it there, waiting, perhaps for someone else, perhaps for no one. Stories like that, stories full of soil and sorrow, of ghosts and guilt, don't always get endings. Sometimes they simply settle, like dust, like ash, and somewhere deep in the walls of room 6, if you listen very closely, you might still hear the soft scurry of tiny feet and the whisper of pages turning in the dark. Final reflection, themes, emotions, and echoes in the corn. In the quiet dark, after the last line is written and the final page laid down, what lingers from Wilfred James's story is not the scream, but the silence that followed it. This is not a tale of monsters in the night. Not really. It's a story about the monsters that grow in the soil of regret, watered by pride, nourished by stubbornness, and harvested in loneliness. At its heart, 1922 is a meditation on guilt. Not the loud kind, not the kind that bursts forth in wild confessions or courtroom tears, but the slow, creeping guilt that moves like roots underground. The kind you carry in your bones, pretending not to feel it even as it reshapes the way you walk, the way you breathe. Wilf's crime was brutal, yes, but what followed was quieter, and somehow more terrifying. It was the weight of knowing, of having done something irreversible, of trying to move forward when something inside you insists on always looking back. He thought he could bury it, that terrible night, his wife's voice, his son's innocence, as if guilt could be lowered into a well and forgotten. But the well does not stay dry, and the rats always return. The rats, those scuttling symbols, are not just pests in this story. They are memory. They are consequence. They are the scratching at the back of a mind unraveling. They follow Wilf not just as punishment, but as presence, the physical embodiment of everything he cannot wash away. And the land, that stretch of Nebraska soil he clung to so fiercely, it too plays a part. The land is Wilf's pride, his anchor, his legacy, but it is also his prison. Its silence becomes too heavy, its crops fail, its walls decay. What he once called home becomes a tomb for truth and a cradle for madness. There's something deeply sorrowful in Wilf himself. He is both villain and victim, a man of his time, of stubbornness and patriarchy, of a world that told men they had to own, to dominate, to endure. His pride destroyed his family, but his punishment was not swift. It was long, drawn out, measured in lost years and slow rot. We see him, not as a monster to fear, but as a man to mourn. Because how many of us have done something we regret and try to justify it, explain it away, wrap it in reasons and circumstance? How many of us carry small, silent guilt like folded letters in the lining of our hearts? Wilf's story is an extreme, but its echoes are familiar. T2 whispers to us about choices, about how a single decision, made in anger, made in fear, can echo outward in ripples we can never fully trace. It invites us to ask, What do we cling to, even when it begins to poison us? What dreams do we bury in the name of legacy, or tradition, or control, and perhaps most haunting of all? What happens when we lose the ones we love? Not to death, but to the consequences of our own doing. In the end, there is no neat resolution, no bright sunrise over the fields. Just a letter left behind, unread, unanswered, and the wind rising through corn stalks, whispering things that can't quite be heard. It is not a scream. It is a hush, a pause, a moment to wonder. What do we carry that no one else can see? What truths lie buried just beneath the surface? And if we listen very carefully, in the stillness before sleep, can we hear them stirring? So rest now, gentle dreamer. Let Wilf's story fade like mist on the field, like ink bleeding at the edge of a page. Let the rats scurry back to shadow. Let the ghosts close their eyes. Let the farm grow quiet once more. And as you drift off, remember, you are not alone with your thoughts. We all carry something, but tonight you carry only breath and the sound of your heart and the hush of a world turning soft around you. Good night, and may your dreams be light as the prairie wind.